books include the novel In Country, which was made into a movie, Spence plus Lila, Shiloh and Other Stories, Nancy Culpeper, Feather Crowds, the memoir Clear Springs, and her new novel, The Girl with the Boomerang. Attended a school without indoor plumbing. She and her sister Janice wore dresses made from flour sacks. For entertainment, her family fished and swam in a local lake. Drive-in movies, a great pleasure, came later. So much of the culture that I had thought made me inferior turned out to be my wellspring, she says. Her fiction and nonfiction show her to be a devoted observer and listener. She grew up around colorful speakers. Her father once declared, "I'm going to get me a bicycle and a goat if it takes me the rest of my life." Her newest novel is based on the World War II experience of her father-in-law. Journalism permits a reader to witness history. Fiction lets a reader live it. Her novel exemplifies this quote: "The complexity of love and memory, the art of flying, and the passage and resonance of time are among the subjects which this new novel explores so richly." Our interview will be conducted today by MFA fiction writing students Wade Davis and Brandon Davis. Please welcome Bobbie and Mason.
Well, Bobbie Ann, welcome to Memphis, and we're delighted to have you today. From your acknowledgments and Girl in the Blue Beret, you spent some time in the home of Michelle Agniel, the inspiration for the character of Annette, where you researched her experiences as an escort for Allied airmen shot down in occupied Europe in 1943 and 44. Speak some about your research process concerning Madame Agniel. What surprised or shocked you about her recollections, and how ultimately did you decide what to keep for the novel and what to stop?
I was initially inspired by experiences of my father-in-law in World War II. His B-17 had been shot down over Belgium, and he made his way to safety with the help of the French resistance, which meant people who hid him, sheltered him, found him a fake ID card, or made it for him, and got him down on the train toward the Pyrenees, and then guided over the Pyrenees Mountains in the snow. So that was my initial inspiration. One of the people who had helped him was this Michelle Agniel, whom you mentioned. When I was researching the novel, I thought I would write a story about a pilot who had been shot down and then tried to get through France. But I needed to know what that would be like. I had certain things for my father-in-law to go on, but I wanted to invent a story to write some fiction. And so I went to France in search of my story and the context and the feeling of what it was like to be in France, and to think about what it was like to hide from the Germans in wartime. And this Michelle had been a girl escort of aviators. There were so many of these aviators who were shot down and they needed help. And her family had made false ID cards for them and had sheltered many of them. And so I was able to look her up. And she's now 85 years old, and I first met her about 3 years ago. And so I went to her and got her to talk about her memories. And the thing that astonished me most was how welcoming she and others I met who had been in the resistance, how welcoming she was to make a contact with somebody connected to somebody who remembered that experience, who went through that experience. Like most war veterans, I guess, the experience of the war remains the most intense and significant experience of their lives. So there's a kind of unseen bond between people who went through it together. And my father-in-law died several years ago, and they had met again. She and my father-in-law had met again in 1993 after nearly 50 years. And I discovered that there was this tremendous bond between the downed pilots who were caught in the war and the French helpers who were so grateful to the aviators for taking bombs to Germany to get them out from under the German occupation that they were suffering from. So she just opened up to me and told me a lot about what it was like to be in the war, to be a schoolgirl in the war, and to have her school occupied by Germans. Typically, the Germans would take a school, put the school children in one half, and they would take the other for their headquarters. I always say the French are rude in those stereotypes, and very private in their home lives. But when it came to this gratitude toward America in the war, these old people they have not forgotten, and they just welcomed me like I was just kind of tangentially connected, but she welcomed me, and others did too, like a long-lost relative.
Well, you mentioned that the novel is based off of your father-in-law's experiences, and the main character, Marshall Stone, just really seems to exemplify, I guess, the mindset of someone who would have been in the military in World War II. So we were wondering, how much of a part did your father-in-law play in developing Marshall's character?
Well, I knew him as an airline pilot, an airline captain of 747s, and he was very much the professional, steely-eyed, handsome stereotype of the pilot, and he was very reserved. And when he talked about the war and his experiences being shot down and having to hide, he tended to make light of it. He didn't want to confess his fragility or his memory of being terrified. So he tended to not laugh it off, but to turn it into interesting stories. And so I think he formed a good basis for Marshall Stone.
Well, you mentioned that he told stories to kind of make light of it. What was it about this story in particular, the B-17 crash, that inspired you?
The B-17 is an incredible airplane. The experience of the B-17 in World War II, and somewhere in there I say, this will never happen again. We'll never see this again on Earth when there are 1,000 of them overhead, all making this very distinctive, very loud sound. And I've seen B-17s and been inside them. They come to the airports. The Memphis Belle is probably right here. And they tour around. There are probably only fewer than a dozen left. They go to airports and the public can go look at them. And so I did this, and I tried to imagine what it would have been like in the war. And there are certain experiences that were common to all the aviators, the sound of the B-17, how cold it was up there in the high in the air, 10 men cramped into this relatively small plane. Just details about the B-17 that were fascinating, and I just tried to imagine these guys taking off on these very daring missions, and many of them, especially the pilots, being just gung-ho to go there and drop the bombs and get Hitler. So I had to learn a lot about B-17s in order to fly this mission in fiction.
Shifting gears a little bit and talking something about the content of the novel, there's this really profound and captivating scene in which Marshall is returned to France and he's speaking with Annette, who is the girl in the blue beret. She's telling him about some of the stories and anecdotes of her captivity in occupied Europe. To quote something from the text, you write, "We could hear the sounds of street life outside." This is Annette speaking to Marshall. Mostly German sounds, but now and then a French word called through the air, or a child singing. We clung to those French words. We always spoke French to the officers who questioned us, meaning German officers. We refused their words. We wouldn't repeat them. Throughout the novel, I found very few instances in which you used German. And so I was wondering if that was conscious on your part. Did you deliberately avoid the German in order to give some credence by way of content to Annette's assertion that we quote, refused their words?
I didn't think about that as a conscious rejection of the German language. I simply didn't know any German. And I was struggling hard enough with French. But I was trying to be true to the French protectiveness of their language. It's one of the things they were most proud of. And one of the things that offended French in Paris the most was when the Germans came, they changed all the street signs so that they read in German. And this was very offensive to the French. So I was conscious of trying to show that aspect of the way they felt assaulted. There's a German word that came into popular use in English and in French too, I think, at the time, and that was the word ersatz. You don't hear that anymore, but it's a fake or substitute. They were talking about ersatz coffee because they couldn't get real coffee very often, and they got some kind of substitute, and it's called ersatz. And that entered the English language.
Well, your first novel, In Country, also dealt with kind of this idea of veterans struggling with a post-war life, and I think Girl in the Blue Beret definitely focuses on that as well. Can you tell us why the struggles of veterans has been such a, I guess, a strong presence in these two novels?
Well, I can make up something. Let's see.
Well, and I think it's interesting. I'm sorry for interrupting, but earlier we were talking, and I asked you what was it about Vietnam that inspired In Country, and you said nothing, and you got back into a corner. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
I backed into it. Well, let's see. When I was writing In Country about Vietnam, I hadn't been to Vietnam. I was a girl. I hadn't been to war. How could I write about war? Writing about the domestic life after the war was the way I could get into it and a way I could try to imagine it. And so my character's question in Country, Sam, the young girl whose father died in Vietnam, her question was, what happened to him and what was the war like? What was it like in Vietnam? What was this all about? Where were you? Why won't you talk about it? So the veterans' experience, you know, I was trying to probe into that the way Sam was trying to probe into it. And in The Girl in the Blue Beret, Marshall Stone, 36 years after the war, this takes place in 1980 with a parallel narrative in 1944, as people remember and tell their stories about 1944. I was writing up. These were my challenges. I was writing about a man who had been to war, World War II, in French, the French culture, flying B-17 missions. I was just in over my head, and I knew it. And because none of those things were things that I was really familiar with. And I knew I was in over my head, but I tend to do that. I tend to jump in and figure I'll get out somehow. And so writing from the veteran's perspective was a way of probing into the war and asking those same questions about what it was like.
Another question I had was, in a nation where we're coming out of another war, are there any insights on the post-war experience that you might like to share with a culture who's dealing with that right now?
Something you said earlier struck me. You said that the current wars seem distant, but that when you read about World War II, it becomes immediately vivid and compelling reading. And I guess I feel there is something like that we don't know how to relate to what's going on, and probably we don't want to know too much about what's going on. And the Vietnam veterans felt that. They felt ignored and rejected when they came home. The atrocities and the violence was a daily report on TV, and we got hardened to it. It just became commonplace, and we felt helpless. And there's something about the distance of a war, a distance in time, that starts to awaken an interest and a curiosity. I think with World War II, the guys came home, got back to work, started building the society. There was a lot of prosperity after the war. People settled down, had the baby boom. And the veterans didn't talk much about it. And everybody thought, well, they did their job and let's get on with it. And it wasn't until relatively recently that World War II surfaced with a compelling urgency. And I set my novel in 1980, which I thought was about the time veterans were starting to want to tell their stories. The D-Day anniversaries would be coming up. In France, there were things going on that started to surface to get the French to step out of their amnesia. For one thing, people started denying the Holocaust, and that awoke a lot of people to the urgency of witnessing what had happened, to awaken those memories and to start taking stock of all that. And so in the interest in World War II just became frenzied almost with all those anniversaries of D-Day. And now that that generation is dying off very rapidly, there seems to be a frantic urgency to get their stories before they die. And many of the people who are coming to my readings of The Girl in the Blue Beret seem to be coming because they're interested in World War II more than they're interested in reading novels. This way we relate to wars just seems to be human nature. The greatest epics written about the Trojan War, I don't know, they probably were written hundreds of years later. These epics then will last for generations and hundreds of years. And the Civil War, the writers didn't really deal with the Civil War until 100 years later. And then it got going, and now it's raging. the interest in war. So I guess the answer is we just can't deal with it at the time. We don't know what to make of it.
On that note of, you mentioned distance and time, I hesitate to characterize Girl in the Blue Beret as historical fiction. It's something of a loaded term, but in a lot of ways it does serve as a historical document in terms that you just expressed. There's a quote from Annette in which she says, her mother, quote, says, "If I don't go out to be a witness, young people are never going to know how it was." Some of this sentiment may also apply to the themes in your novel, In Country, in terms of the savagery in the experience in Vietnam and the urgency with which Sam needs to know how the Vietnam War really was. Since war is such an integral part of the American experience, it's often left to American writers to express what survivors of those conflicts, those wars, cannot. Talk with that, what this means to you as a fiction writer. Share with us, if you would, about what this being a witness so others know how it was means to you.
Cary, what was that quote you started with?
Journalism allows a reader to witness history. Fiction allows a reader to live it.
Yeah, that is the job of the fiction writer, not to document it and get all the footnotes right, but to get you to enter into the experience and to live it, to know what it was like. And for that, a fiction writer starts with, and maybe deals with, almost exclusively with details. When I went to meet this woman, Michelle and Yell, who had been the girl in the blue beret, so to speak, one of the first things I asked her was, tell me about what your school book satchel looked like. I wanted to be able to describe her as a schoolgirl, to describe Annette as a schoolgirl. So I said to Madame Agnel, what did your school bag look like? And she started describing it, and she even drew me a picture of this leather bag that had the buckles at the bottom, and it was like wings, and they were buckled at the bottom with a handle at the top, and it was leather. And she said, I called it my vache, V-A-C-H-E, which means cow, I guess the leather. And she said that one thing they liked to do, the schoolgirls, was to strategically loosen the leather straps and let their books fall on the feet of the Germans at just the right moment. And so details and little bits of information, little images and things like that are what you build the story out of. And to me, the reality of it, what it was really like doesn't come fully into my imagination until I've worked on it and constructed it and added details and polished it, and then suddenly it becomes real. And the same with the character